Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for coming. Let me get my notes out. This is a great crowd. So many faces I know, but so many I don't. That's so exciting. Hi, Claire. I just saw you. I wanted to first thank our artists, our panelists, for being here tonight. They are really quite an extraordinary combination of people, and their practices are so diversely interesting, but come around this topic that we're going to cover tonight. But I just really want to thank them for making time out of their very busy schedules to come down and be with us and to lead a conversation that, for me, is the beginning of an ongoing dialogue here in Miami about social practice and how artists want to engage with this kind of work that I think we need to model better in Miami and South Florida, everywhere, but really here, now that we're here with YoungArts. I'd also like to thank my staff who do so much work to make these events so beautiful, and especially Esther Park for organizing this evening and our Salon program. She's an amazing cultural curator, so I'm very grateful to have her on our staff. And I'd also like to acknowledge a handout that she created that was on each of your seats. That is a compendium of resources for artists or anyone really interested in social practice. And it goes across disciplines, which is really helpful too, because there's artists in every discipline doing this kind of work. And so if this is helpful to you, we hope that it is, and we hope that it's just one of many tools that we start putting out into the public to help stir the conversation around this. And I also want to acknowledge some friends that we have in the audience, because obviously we can't do this work. None of us can do this work without the support that comes in by funders and partners and sponsors. And starting last year, we started something new. We work across 10 disciplines, and each of the disciplines, we're now looking for partners and sponsors who are particularly interested in that discipline. So Arquitectonica, who, the amazing architecture firm, home here in Miami, so many iconic buildings designed by them, is now our architecture and design discipline sponsor, which I'm so grateful for them for doing that. And Related Group is our new sponsor for the visual arts, and that's an amazing partnership as well. And for both of them to be here tonight, I think is perfect because of the conversation we're going to be having. So thank you all for being here and for helping. So I'd like to bring them up now. We have Teresita, Fernandez, and Mel Chin, and Chat Travieso, who is our YoungArts alumni. We're so happy to have him back in Miami. I think, is this one, should this one go here? Oh, I'm going to sit here, okay. Okay. So, okay. I think a great way to begin this evening is just by listening to each of the artists speak a little bit about their work. Each of you has a really distinct practice in both art making and so the way that you engage in social practice, depending on how you want to frame it. So I'd like to take a few minutes with each of you, in order that you're seated, to show a little bit about your work and speak a little bit about the way you work or research or process or whatever it is you want to speak about, and then we'll get into some questions after that.
Hi everyone, is this on?
There you go.
Hi. It's so nice to see so many people from my Miami days in the audience. Hi, Peter. And it's so great to be here. And I just want to say, before I start talking about the whole spiel, that I am here because I just believe so much in what YoungArts does. And I'm so delighted that Carolina is leading and bringing her vision to this place, because it really, like everything we say tonight, and I'm just gonna say this, is really about the future and how you shape that future and how you can model things for people who are younger than you. And so I'll just start talking. So I wanted to start with this, which is a piece that I have permanently installed in the atrium of the Blanton Museum in Austin, Texas. And I specifically put this picture, and it's called Stacked Waters. And basically this is the entrance into the museum. The museum starts kind of on the second floor, so it was this very alienating space where you have to go up 50 steps to get to the space above. And so I treated it almost, and it was a weird space, so I treated it almost like this ancient Roman cistern that was completely transformed, and kind of playing with this idea of filling the void, the space up with water. And so this is often how my work is represented, right? As this kind of visual thing that could be mistaken for design or abstraction. The space is actually a really important public space that's activated all the time. And so what people often don't think of in the work is how important the ambulatory viewer is in the space itself. So this space is used in many different ways, and when it's full of people, you get a very different sense of how what started in my work as a conceptual interest in immersive spaces as an extension of the body and the ambulatory moving through space started to be this sort of reflection of programming and who's in that space, and how can I actually, if I make this space, how can I also be an important part of how the programming and how it's used be activated. This is a piece called Black Sun that was installed at Mass MoCA last year. Sorry, I couldn't see all of it. And again, usually when you see pictures of the work, the work is often not thought of as being particularly political in any way. I'm often not thought of as an artist who is an activist, et cetera, because we have been taught to think that these things are different. This is a very immersive piece too. It's almost 100 feet long. You could see it from 2 different balconies. You could also walk underneath the length of it. So it's a very sort of experiential piece, as are most of my works. And then there's everything that happens underneath it, right? And the way that it changes when people are reflected in it and become an extension of the physical properties of the artwork itself. So what started to happen is that I realized that I had this incredible opportunity and responsibility to not just make these things that were often perceived as beautiful, but to then use the kind of privilege that space provided me with influencing what could happen underneath them. And so with this piece, which is called Fata Morgana, which was installed in Madison Square Park in the middle of New York City, and it was up for about a year, it's a piece where all the walkways are covered with these reflective mirrored gold forms, the shapes that hang over your head, and everything is kind of reflected up in it. I think this is a video. How do I play? Oh, there you go. Okay, so here's a time lapse. About 50,000 people a day walk through this space, through this park. And so for me, it was this incredible opportunity to use it as a reflection of the urban landscape, but also like a portrait of the commuters and a portrait of what happens there. And I thought, the people in the park kept referring to the public and public art. And I kind of kept saying, well, what public, right? Because their idea of the public was not my idea of the public. And it became very clear to me that there are always these concentric publics, and there's always an invisible public or many invisible publics, right? So it just depends who's looking, and that lens of perception with what we call these things and who's doing the looking is essential, right? Because it defines everything. So other people's idea of who was the public were people who lived in these high-rise condos, which were very expensive, that surround and look on around the park there. I kept saying for every expensive restaurant, there's somebody working in that kitchen who can't read this sign because they don't read English, and they use this space too. Or for every nanny who's pushing a stroller, these programs are not designed for them. And so I became very aware and sort of had to be very creative about how I address these things, because it wasn't really what they wanted to hear. They wanted to, and so this is one of the things about artists, is that you can kind of sneak your way into places and wiggle in and create change without people necessarily noticing, and that's a very powerful thing. So I did a series of events. This is a bilingual poetry reading, which was enormously successful. I mean, it was packed. Everything that I'm showing you was also doubled in the piece, so I felt like anything that I could program, I was doubling, I was making visible. This is also a video. I don't know if you're playing it for me. Yes? Okay. So this is a short clip. This is a short clip from an event that I did with a friend of mine named Fernandez, who's a scholar of Afro-Cuban culture. And what we did is we recreated Dia de Reyes underneath Fata Morgana, which in colonial times in Cuba, and this was right after the whole kind of Obama announcement and all that, so it was current events kind of framing. Dia de Reyes was the only day in colonial times in Cuba where enslaved Africans could perform their music and dances in public space. So it was this way of sort of activating public space and claiming it and sort of educating people too, right? Because there was all this sort of media frenzy around what it meant at the moment. And then this is a video as well. Yeah. I'm definitely talking more than 5 minutes. Should I stop there? So this is this is a collaboration I did with Stephen Petronio, which invited. It was an open call, musicians, dancers. It was at night. It was kind of an amazing event too. And then last, I'm just going to say that separate from that, I also did this a symposium with the Ford Foundation. They gave me a grant to the symposium focused on Latinx art futures, and I felt a great need, and I felt like I could be helpful in bringing this sort of national conversation about the lack of representation of Latinos in all conversations of diversity, pretty much, as well as in museum representation, museum collections, et cetera. So I hope that wasn't too long. I'm going to pass this on to the master over here.
Called me a master, but you know what they say in Texas, get away from that wheelbarrow, you don't know anything about machinery. I was excited to see that it's YoungArts, and I expect a bunch of kids, so my remarks are tailored, and I realized that I should have taken my pharmaceuticals. So then you move this thing like that, right? And there I go. Uh-oh. Oh, my name. Damn. Okay. All right. So now it's blank, and I'll just keep it going. The middle button. You okay? You're gonna? Okay. Well, this is outside New York right now. It's you can't have South Florida without Southern California. So we just took a chunk of it and landed that fantasy right there at 18th Street. And so you enter through a fantasy, but you approach this reality. You know, and it's it's about the Gala Committee, and Gala Committee inserted artwork secretly, covertly, on Melrose Place for 2 years, 20 years ago, and we had pieces like Total Proof, and it's one of hundreds of works that inundated primetime television. It was a conceptual project done covertly on primetime TV. Can you dig it? Okay, let's keep it going. So that's evidence of it, but there's hundreds of work, and it's there now. If you ever get up there, that's up north from here, check it out, okay? All right, so keep it going, and we'll keep it moving. So proof, and then there's other things. Revival Fill was done in the 89 and 90 to 93. And a lot of people, art people, look at this as a form, oh, look at that nice garden that had these plants that were hyper accumulators, that had the capacity to pull heavy metal from soil. What Revival Fill is not the formal thing, but a conceptual proof of hyper accumulation, remediation with plants. It's an art project that confirms science, and sometimes people don't know that, and that's probably the most important thing about it. That we liberated science from their need to have proof. So there you have it. Through a work of art that gave them proof. What the hell? That didn't come out that well for science. If you're any scientists in there, forgive me. Continue. So this is like proof, hyperaccumulation. This is what we go for, something to open up the territory. Next slide, let's keep. And so you have, but you know, sometimes when you do conceptual work, political work, things in the field, it doesn't mean you have to take yourself away from your personal individual achievements and a way of, you have to go back into what you do to liberate your imagination. So I did for a year after my parents died, I cut up the entire Funk and Wag encyclopedia, and about 512 collages came out of it. I just put this one in. This is no appetite for island architecture since we're here in Miami, but we can keep moving. But it was the, you can keep moving, it's okay. It was a complete Funk and Wag encyclopedia cut up into these hand-pasted, hand-glued images that, you can have another one, you know. So each volume was, but I have one more maybe, and so each volume was created. And the reason for this is, like, you know, there's dead literature sometimes when a 53 Funk and Wag encyclopedia is the images are terminated, you know, by time. But through the practice of conceptual or contemporary art, you can give it life again. And so it's a re-editing of every image from every page, redone into just a very, very mausoleum living kind of work. So you're not trapped, so you can move around is what I'm trying to say. So all you young people out there, I see hundreds of you, don't hold yourself accountable for anything. You can keep moving. Yeah, keep it rolling, I'm sorry. And then there's, after Katrina, there was, I went down to help, but the magnitude of what had happened to those people was so profound that I found myself like, I need to come up with something of equal magnitude, but I couldn't figure it out until, why do that maybe? I saw this map. I kept researching my inadequacy. You research to destroy your preconceived notions, and sometimes that research does not create any inspiration, but you are compelled to act. Because this map conveys that before the storm, 30 to 50% of the inner city childhood population of New Orleans were poisoned with lead, compromising their lives forever, and there was no money for it. So we decided to create a $100 bill project. You can look it up, you know, I don't have it on my website, it's up. Now, fundred, as in 100 with an F, .org, like an organism. You can look it up yourself. You can download your template, and you don't, that's Tatiana, who's like 12, and that's Rosina Wolford Ward in St. Louis, who's 92. So don't say you're too old to do one drawing, because we are collecting them till we have the hundreds of America. This project is not about me. We're delivering it to inform not only members of Congress, but the network of people there dedicated to solve the problem. And that's why also I'm in DC now. We're working on this sucker to get it done. And it's not about me, it's about you. You draw 100, I work for you. Keep it rolling, yeah. So it's for this kind of stuff. Flint paid the highest water bills in 2015. It's about money, isn't it? And you have people compromised. So this project is about places all over America, and it's also in Miami. Thank you very much. Continue on. So, and also sometimes you end up in North Africa. They heard of the funded. People of the Western Sahara heard about the funded, and they wanted me to come there. So we started designing currency. You know why? Because they have no freedom and they have no currency. You know, they thought they wanted to bring the guy with the money. I had no money. I said, so we have to figure something out. So this is the Western Sahara. And so we started thinking about something, a place where we could create a currency free of oil and free of gold, where the currency is solar backed, so we could have the first Bank of the Sun. You keep it moving. And that Bank of the Sun is, its symbol is dedicated to the word freedom, rotated 38 years. They've waited now 40 years for the right for the self-determination. So projects, again, do not have to be about me. It is about the future and thinking something, because if they do this Bank of the Sun, they can show that we don't have to be afraid to determine our lives based on a solar influence. keep it rolling. It's all right. And sometimes there's data about the oceans. There's data that how do we understand science? Science tells us that climate change is going to mess us up. I think y'all have seen some of it, but I know you're still building. I don't want to get in your way, but it's a reality. It is a bad reality. So sometimes an art can be made and dedicated to convey scientific process. An artwork can be the catalytic structure that makes you want to understand data that is relevant to your life. And you make films. I was just in Paris. We started this film. These are 7 pools pulling an Inuit from Kana. This film is being cut. We're going to finish it up. Well, let me tell you something. We went there, and yeah, because this is the dream sequence, and it's not animated. I'm not going to show you the film. Am I doing okay for time?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm almost done. But this film is to promote a thing that says thearcticis.org, so you can find out what Miami is like. But in this film, what happened, I went there in COP21. We flew Jens Danielson from Kana, the most northernmost point of human habitation in Greenland. He came to Paris to give a message that the world has a mortal fever. His culture is dying because of climate change. He is the witness. And it's not, he said, and the whole message is about its relation to Miami, not something so separate. But this is a dream sequence, and we had to shoot it that way because when we landed and we were ready to film with the poodles and the sled, ISIS attacked. And all production was halted, and all monies were lost. And I re-scripted the film, and we shot this sequence and did guerrilla-style filming and did it anyway. Because the obligation is this: when something like that happens, we all lose. And if we do not exercise our creativity and stand for it and take your life savings and what the hell you got to do, then we will lose more. And it must be done. And that's the obligation. I think one more. Okay, so you go, because, and it's about changing things. This is the Melrose Place pool done as a convo pit, so you could have intercourse of the verbal kind. And I did this piece because there's still humor and there's still levity, but there's also room to fracture the landscape of mansplaining conceptual art. And you need to try to do that more, and you create art to convey that. Anyway, that's just a short take on a couple of things. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Travieso. Real quick, I just want to thank Carolina and YoungArts for inviting me to be part of this event, and it's an honor to be here with Mel and Teresita. So let's start. Okay, cool. So my work, I make socially engaged architectural installations that are meant to reinforce communal bonds in our public spaces. My background's actually in architecture and art, so it's kind of a hybrid practice. And one of the things that I strive for in my work is to create or offer an alternative to kind of dominant systems of urban development. And the way I see doing this is creating kind of these small-scale urban interventions that pay attention and are sensitive to the context, involve people in the community who are going to be using the piece in a deeply participatory way, and really kind of respond to people's everyday needs. The projects are meant to, with these kind of small interventions, act as a catalyst for longer-term sort of projects that give people, especially people who've been systematically and systemically excluded from decision-making processes, to have agency in defining their built environment. So the projects are kind of meant to reconsider and consider other ways that the city can be more open, can be more just and equitable. And so I work with local community groups, youth, local residents in the process. And this kind of process of community building and community engagement is more than just kind of a meeting or a workshop or something kind of more tokenistic or paternalistic. It's more about being present, engaging people in conversation, observing and listening. So I don't come in with a preconceived idea of what a question is, but just kind of understanding. It's kind of an empathic sort of process, right? And also understanding that I might get it wrong, and people will adapt the work, so the work exists, even after it's built. It's not just the picture and then it's gone. So I'm going to give you guys some background on some of these projects. So this project it's in the South Bronx in New York, and it's called Boogie Down Booth 174th Street. And this project actually came about through a prior project that I did with this organization called Design Trust for Public Space in partnership with the Department of Transportation in New York that was looking at ways to improve spaces under elevated transit infrastructure, highways, elevated trains, and that sort of thing. So this is kind of the second iteration of the project. And this project came about because with that first iteration, we worked with this organization called WEDCO, Women's Housing and Economic Development Corporation, and that builds affordable housing and does all sorts of economic development in the area. And the project was really looking at ways to deal with the noise of the train. There's an elevated subway right next to the site, and what we came up with was WEDCO has this kind of satellite organization called Bronx Music Heritage Center that's all about celebrating Bronx music and Bronx music heritage. So hip hop was born in the Bronx, Celia Cruz and Tito Puente and all these other salsa, icons were in the Bronx. So this project played music to cover up that noise from the train. And it also functioned as seating for a bus stop. And then we worked with students from a local high school students that was right next door to paint a mural that was about all things Bronx. And it has lighting. One of the things that came up with a lot when we were talking is that the lack of lighting along that street. So that was not something that I had in mind, but then through these conversations, through these observations, this came about, and it's all solar powered. This project, and something that you'll notice that I do a lot is kind of create works that attach to fences and walls and that sort of thing. The idea is to kind of transform these spaces or objects of exclusion into something that brings people together. This project is called Sit Anywhere Borinquen Plaza, and this is public housing development really close to where I live, actually, where it was inspired by people just sitting outside on the sidewalk and just sparking up a conversation with people. Came up with this idea of actually having the seating embedded into the fence, and it's these fold-up seats. So had workshops with the senior center that was part of the housing development, and the project came about. And then another project that attaches to a fence. This project is called Wordplay, and this piece came about. It was kind of a design sort of competition type thing that was looking at asking people, designers and artists, to create little free libraries, which are these kind of honor system libraries. It's a little place where people can take a book, return a book. It's kind of this exchange system. So I worked with this organization called Two Bridges Neighborhood Council in the Lower East Side to create this library. And it's in the Lower East Side neighborhood close to Chinatown. And it's, extremely multicultural area. So the library says library in English, in Chinese, and in Spanish. And again, working with local youth, the after-school program there. Every year we take down the library and put it back up and kind of reinforce this idea of stewardship, reinforce this idea of ownership. So it's still up. I'm probably going to take it down for the winter and put it back up next year. So it's this constant thing, and it's something I've actually been thinking about too, how people in the community can actually take ownership of a project or transform it or adapt it over time so that it's completely something new and something that wasn't even the beginning thing. It's just and then this last project is called, oh, I'm sorry, there's one more project after this. This project's called On a Fence, and this project, again, rethinking the fence. It took this fence that was along this pop-up park that was actually a culmination of a number of different community organizations in the Lower East Side in New York, that this site eventually is going to become a permanent park, but the city allowed these organizations to have this pop-up park to come up. This site used to be abandoned and closed off to the community for a long time, so this fence project is kind of a way to acknowledge this fence that was there, still kind of acts as a barrier because I wasn't able to take down the fence, but also transform it into something that brings people together. And I collaborated with this graphic designer, Ye Choi, to create this project. So it has a number of different seating areas, play areas, and of course, as you can tell, I like color and kind of something that is more playful. Chalkboard walls, I'm a big fan of those too. And then finally, this last project is called Kiddo Cart, and this project I did in North Carolina in Greensboro, and it's part of this museum called the Elsewhere Museum, which is a pretty awesome museum actually. And this trailer, it's this trailer that opens up and transforms into a number of different sort of performance spaces or seating spaces, depending on the event. So here you have the kind of bleacher seating setup that we had at the opening, and we had a number of community organizations give presentations. This organization that has the basketball, they teach kids about poetry through basketball. We had open mic and karaoke, which was a lot of fun. That's the storefront of the Elsewhere Museum. And then we had performance one day, and finally we also set it up as a kind of workspace. And again, kind of rethinking the parking space as opposed to something that a car would occupy. It's a place where people can occupy and come together. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'm having this fantasy of this collaborative work that would involve fencing and covering and land and growing, and all three of you working together. So first, I want to thank the audience. We queried the audience in advance to write in some questions, and several of you did, and I'll be mixing those in with some of my own questions. So thank you. There were some really, really great questions. I'm going to start with this idea that in visual art practice, the artist traditionally works alone. And most of the time, it's sort of how you're trained in the studio practice in school. And yet this kind of work, in many ways, requires that you integrate yourself into the community in some way, or work with partners, or consider the community around you. And I think all of you showed works that really spoke to that in different ways. So I'm curious about how that works for an artist in terms of whether you want to call it your ego or sort of your own practice within something that becomes less your own over time, that you have to, in a way, relinquish to either those partners or that community or that cause, and whether that worries you or sort of how you deal with that, or whether that was something that you on purpose kind of transitioned your practice toward over time. Because I think it's interesting what Teresita was saying, that it's almost like you made the work and then you realized the world that was happening beneath it or within it, and that then changed the way you were working, right? Or that your experience in New Orleans, or how you work with partners all the time. So, but then the tension of that with being this individual practitioner who wants to sort of have an identity within that work, and where that is for you. Any of you can start.
I guess I'll say a quick word about it. I mean, like I said, my background is in architecture and art. So architecture, I think, is inherently social. At least that's the way I interpret it. And the way I like to think of architecture, I'm interested in being out there and talking to people. I mean, architecture is about people inhabiting spaces, the kind of social element of that, and the fact that our built environment is created by people and the decisions that we make and the policies that we put in place. So you can't get away from that. And I think for me, I'm actually inspired by how people adapt things. I'm inspired by like that project Sit Anywhere wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been walking around my neighborhood and seeing people sitting on the sidewalk, and just being like, well, there's seating in the courtyard of the building, but people aren't sitting there. Why are they sitting here? So it becomes this kind of loop of just research, observation, and then understanding, especially creating work that exists in the public realm, that it's going to be adapted. Someone might use something differently, or even graffiti it, and understanding, at least for me, understanding like what that means for the work, or how that changes the work. And I'm completely comfortable with that. And last thing I want to say though is, because the reason I'm comfortable with that is because the way I see community engagement is not necessarily like asking like, what do you want? And then just providing that, but it's more of a conversation. Mm-hmm. Because I think that the first way of like, what do you want? And then just doing that is very kind of patronizing in a way, because that conversation and understanding what my expertise are and being able to share that is a lot more honest and a lot more collaborative.
Yeah, I really dig it how people can discover it and own it for themselves. And I love those chair things. I'm always looking for a place to sit down. But I've said it, you might want to put this off the record because I said it so much that I'm too old to be an emerging artist, so I have to settle for a submerging artist. But that's all fun, but maybe it is true, like what I'm discussing is that sometimes it's precisely that if you go into these situations where you're compelled into action to have some creative answer and some response, one of the first things to go is your own persona can go. It's expendable. It's a whole different issue, like from the other stuff I could do. There's the market and there's the collectors and all that. But no, this is about your relationship in a way about how you can better the world that you walk in. It's almost selfish. I don't want to walk down the street of any city, major urban city, be gunned down because of an anger that has emerged out of a flawed mind that's been compromised by a condition that was based on environmental racism. You see? And so you think about these things from a more ecological perspective, and it makes total sense. And if not me, why? And then it's not about me. It is truly a condition of the we that gets in and then what are the conditions for that? So it's more complicated. Each project is different and each of the characteristics are different, but as a conceptualist, I'm able to go that way, But I like reality therapy. I like it to be real. It may take years and it takes a sustained effort and it takes its toll, I've been working 10 years in from New Orleans to the entire United States, now in DC. It takes a while, but there's no reason to stop. I almost was ready to deliver with Creative Time and Smithsonian last year. Then Flint came up. And I told everybody, we're not done.
My take on that is that people have very delusional ideas about what the community is, right? The community is always like this thing out there that's not you or me or anybody that you know. And it's always like faceless. So it's very dangerous sometimes. One of the most important things that I did in all of the programming and sort of my strategy in any public art project that I do where I'm controlling or strategizing on the programming is I have people who are willing to give me money as an artist, a budget, to create programming, but they're not going to give that same budget to the people that I'm inviting necessarily. And so one of the most important things that I did is I paid every single person that worked to create content underneath Fata Morgana. All of those poets got paid. The dancers got paid. The people who organized it got paid. And this is very, very significant because the idea of community implies that they need you more than you need them. And I have an issue with that. I actually think that real change happens when there's a kind of reciprocity, right? And when people are actually validated for the important work that they bring. Community isn't free. It's not just people there who are there to like create content because you have a good idea. And so I kind of have no issues with, like, it's really clear that if you have, a piece that's 500 feet long that's in the middle of Madison Square Park that has, press around it and all kinds of things, it's, I'm pretty secure that I know it's my piece, that I made it, so I don't have any attachments to it at all, right? It's very clear. For me, the interesting part becomes how those things don't have to be either or. It's either yours or it's the community's, but how it can actually be both and how it needs to be both in order to be relevant and in order to use any power and privilege that I might have in that space as an artist to kind of amplify what that space could mean for other people who might use that space. And those are questions that I don't always know the answer to because I may not use that space in the same way that other people do. And there are many people, right? Even when we say people, there's all kinds of communities. There's like communities within communities. And so I think it's important to not make assumptions about who those communities are made, who makes up those communities, and how it's important for communities to define themselves by being given agency and resources to do so.
So that actually is something that's a good segue to this next part, because does this complicate the need for you to gain that necessary agency? You know, so to have the impact that you want to have, you've talked about how artist content is often taken from them, you know, and they don't have the requisite agency that they need. It's sort of taken from them. I don't think that you're saying, in fact, the opposite of what you're saying is that the communities aren't taking that agency from you, but potentially other agents are taking that. So I wonder, like, as an artist practicing in the social sphere in this way, sort of outside the museum or gallery system, does that happen to you in the same way? This is just in follow-up to what you're saying, as it does.
I'm going to just take this one and say one thing that's really important. I think every artist who's donating an artwork for a gala, for a museum, to raise money, should be getting some kind of influence over what happens with the money that they raise. Okay, when donors, and so it's just because we've been taught to think that that's not our space, right? Somebody can write a check for $20,000 and get their name on the wall, but your artwork could be sold at a gala auction for $80,000 and you're nowhere. You have no control over that, how that money is used. And so even artists themselves, and you know, many of them do, many of them don't think they can or think about this, but I do think that it's just about not waiting for anybody to give you permission to do these things, but rather just demanding them, because these are spaces that we are occupying and that we have incredible leverage, and we have people listening to us if we bring them up as artists.
I think related to that, I mean, how you were saying that artists can wiggle in and sort of covertly make these changes happen by virtue of having the influence that you have at different points of your career, and why you think artists are better suited are better positioned, rather, maybe to translate or uncover or provoke this kind of dialogue. Like you were saying, you know, that you planted these trees, you kind of took it away from science, like taking away the need to sort of prove it. You know, the art itself proved it. Or why is it that artists are, in a way, better positioned or called upon to do this kind of work? I find it interesting that you would be funded to make this public piece in the park, and yet they really wanted to control how you were going to use that content. And then you kind of took that away from them and said, no, I'm going to use that money to pay other artists and to bring these sort of invisible communities in. And that's really interesting, you know, so why, maybe that's, I'm answering the question in a way myself and I shouldn't, but handing that over to you, why you think artists do this differently than other people?
I want to say about Revival Field that it's not that artists could do it better. It was that no one was allowed to do it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you understand something that may be scientific, and the poetry is so powerful and provocative, then to let it die is a crime. Mm-hmm. So you bring in the pragmatics of science to help them engage and create the replicated field tests necessary to prove what they are denied by the forces that be to get funding for. So you do it for 1/10 of the funding, and you struggle for 3 years or whatever you gotta do. But it's sort of like a Malcolm XXX, by any means, action, methodology necessary, you know, because it's a frightful world, you know. And approaching communities and working on something that is another criminal reality that we live in such toxic kind of zones within our urban cities is almost like, that's not for me. I don't think of it that I'm gonna change a damn thing, but I do believe art is a catalytic structure that can compel maybe something to emerge. And if I could be part of that, and you understand you're only a part of something, and that the whole process also, when you work with community members and people and children that are poisoned, that you become, you be engaged as, and be evolutionary in your position. It's not always my project. In fact, the most important thing that a project can be conceived, but it evolves out of your hands into the ownership of the public it was addressing or coming to. And know that that's the coolest thing, because that is poetry. So the poetic dynamics, to me, you have to gauge it in your own mind, to start to finish, that the biggest poetry that could come out of 100 is that the blood of a child, not the water, not the soil, not the paint. The blood of a child is clean or is away from a neurotoxin. That is the most provocative thing, and it may occur beyond my lifetime. But I'll be damned if I don't stop doing what I have to do now and evolve into position to make sure their voices are amplified.
Well, I'll just add, and it's somewhat related to what you said in the beginning, the kind of loophole aspect of it. I'm really interested in that, how the work, I mean, there are drawbacks to it, of course, because a lot of times artists end up making work for a lot less than what other fields would do it for. But, you know, the fact that the work, or at least my work, kind of straddles that line between design, art, and can, not to get boring, but the permitting process for something like that would be very different for different types of work. So the immediacy of something working within the art realm, engaging people in a different way, in a different context also, community engagement in kind of planning context is very different than just kind of going up to, like, I don't have to do the kind of analytics of this and who did I reach and this and that. It's just like, I'm just going to have conversations with people. I'm just going to go and observe and walk around my neighborhood, walk around this neighborhood. Allows for a lot more flexibility, allows for a lot more experimentation, that poetry to come in, and these kind of site-specific sort of quirks that wouldn't have necessarily existed if it had gone through a longer sort of process.
So just staying on this for one more second, because you're all talking a lot about sort of this outward expression, sort of how this affects whether the communities or many communities you're talking about, or children, or the kind of the audiences of your work. But I heard you, Mel, once say that artists have to wrestle with the places that gave them the most anxiety, and that they have to work through, and if they're able to work through it, they're very lucky. And I'm wondering about, you know, because you were invited to New Orleans. It wasn't sort of something you sought out per sense, and you left at first thinking you couldn't really do much, and you kept going back and learning more, researching, like you say, till it became this kind of moral imperative that you had to deal with. But I wonder if, even though it was about New Orleans, it was about lead poisoning, it was about these children, were you at the same time kind of wrestling with something in your own histories? And I guess it's sort of about all of you, like, where is that work kind of coming in about your own past?
There might be some psychiatrists in the house, so I cannot answer that on the grounds of self-incrimination. But yeah, I think anxiety, if you're raised in Texas and you look like me, it's not going to be helpful. Or anywhere, I'm telling you. But yeah, you wrestle till you're comfortable. And you know, actually I was not invited to New Orleans. I went on my own to see if I could help after the storm. But there is where you discover your inadequacy. And that gives you anxiety, because you see the magnitude was not the Ninth War that was blown away. It was the soul of the people that lost family, the people we interviewed. Rick Lowe and I were down there. We were just talking to people. And you saw the magnitude was much more than what you could measure in a physical scale. And that compels you to say, well, I am inadequate, and I don't know what to do. And admit that after a lifetime of creativity is a hard task. So you go back again and again and again, and sometimes I do turn to science, back to science, to find out, well, then what is here? And then it comes to you in minutes, it comes to you in seconds that something must be done. It was all about the money. And so let's make the money. It doesn't have to be the real capital, but it can be hand-drawn one by one and represent a voice. So that's how you look at it. Each piece is different, by the way, and each anxiety is different if you're living and breathing in the world.
You know, with your work is interesting because it's not obvious to many people that your practice has these sort of social or implications, and that yet you have this activist side of you, whether it's the Latinx Forum, but then Fatima, the work that you did in New York most recently in Madison Park, you did end up sort of bringing in these same issues that you're doing with the forum, you know, and sort of making the invisible visible, the people who are invisible visible. And is that something that, you know, has always been a part of you of wanting to do, that this work is allowing you to do?
I think it wasn't always a part in that way that you described. So it's like after you do something, people want to call it all kinds of things. I was just doing my work. And for me, it's not separate in my mind, right? It's just me thinking and reacting and dealing with my own anxieties. And what we call activist work is just as creative as, you know, everything else that happens in the studio. So I think that's an important thing to note, is that it's not like you make this artwork and then you like stick the activist thing onto it. It is actually very hard to come up with creative and effective ideas that move that needle, that create change. And it's like, if you are not, and I would say if there were any young artists in the audience, the advice that I would give is that—
That was my next question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a little bit, I wanted to say answer it in a different way too, but it's a little bit like, you know, going to the gym. It's like, if you're not feeling it, it's not doing anything. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times people have this notion of wanting to do things, right? But they're not really like, and so the anxiety is actually really the what shows you that you're going in the right direction, because you don't really know the form of it yet. And the anxiety is a very cathartic thing that you follow, because it's where the discomfort is. And all of the things that we are talking about, what they have in common is that they are not comfortable. They're not pretty. They're not things that people want to confront. Inequity is not a pretty thing. And staring at it and really looking at it is important, because that's precisely where you actually start to deal with it in a way that affects you. Right? So most people are happy with dealing with these things when they're about, oh, well, we'll help other people, or we'll this, or we want to create change. But they don't realize that changing themselves and their lens to those things is the thing that actually creates real change. And so it's work. And if it doesn't feel like work, it's probably not doing very much.
I agree.
So taking that, just what your advice would be, I know we have several working artists in the audience, and what it would be to a young aspiring artist. And Chat, you are still, you know, quite young and at the beginning of your career in many ways. So, but even still, you know, the young arts artists that we have through the program are so much younger than you are. And what advice you'd give them to authentically engage in a community, whether it's their own or the complications of doing it in a community that's not necessarily your own.
Well, the way I always kind of think about it is always turn it back to yourself. I mean, I think what you said was beautiful and right on. Like, first just kind of analyze your framing of the world and how you approach and perceive the world, and how you would want someone to approach you about a project. I mean, the golden rule isn't always like exactly, I mean, there's that, the golden rule is do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. Platinum rule is do unto others as they would like to be done. Like, they're, you know, it's like empathy, right? Like, everybody's different, so you can't assume everyone wants the same things you want. But at least it's a good starting point, just kind of seeing like, well, if someone talked to me about a project like that, that's kind of weird or patronizing, or like, why would someone approach me about this? Like, what do they want from me? I mean, I would be suspicious. So I think that's a good starting point, and just kind of approaching the world, and I think observing the world and listening are the most important way to start doing something that would be about engaging. And also what you said also about community. I mean, I think that's crucial, like understanding that community isn't this abstract thing outside of yourself, but you are yourself part of a plethora of different communities, and what that means, and what those communities are, and how they interact and don't, and you know, how to bridge those gaps, and how maybe you can't, and understanding and being comfortable with that, and finding partners that can be help you with that. So I think those are my kind of starting points. But there is no tool. The other thing is that there's no step one, step two. So that it won't work that way, because as soon as you do that, then you kind of, you know, it negates everything. So it's a lot more fluid, and I'm still learning, and every project is different.
Advice?
Oh, advice? Don't do it. No, I think I think Teresita and both of you have said it. I think you know, we're entering this incredibly difficult political arena. I think you'll hear more of it tonight. And we always think about change or whatever, and I was talking to Teresita the other day, it's precisely, if you can't change yourself, don't even begin to think about it. I think the key is behavioral understanding, and if you cannot move yourself into another structure that can give that person who may be prone to violence after an election because they didn't like the color of your skin, the nature of the election, if you cannot, it's not about deprogramming that person. It's about deprogramming yourself so you can put the empathetic edge in there that can possibly give a place for that person who is suffocating because of the tyranny of the ideas that may be upon all us all. So I think the advice I'd say is that just look at yourself, just as you said, and just like you said, is the most important thing. But then to maintain that you got to drop away the delusion that has been hyped on. And you know, they say the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, that's Socratic onto Nietzsche. But hey, sometimes this world of art, this world of culture, this world of consumption has layered so many delusions upon us. And you have to drop them occasionally and be honest if you want to transform yourself and even to analyze yourself in a proper way. Then maybe we can move forward.
I'm just going to ask one more question, then I want to open it up to a couple of questions before we wrap it up. So right now, you know, there are, like you're saying, the political climate is what it is. The time we are in history is what it is. We have emergency after emergency, whether it's Flint or Black Lives Matter, shootings, whatever. I mean, it's like we're just being inundated with emergencies. And how artists want to work in response to these emergencies is problematic because the funding structures, the structures that we have around artists to support and help their work does not work with that kind of practice. And so many of us in the world of stewarding organizations or raising money to help artists are sort of at a loss, you know, and having conversations about how do we help artists who want to work in dealing or healing or working through these emergencies with their communities. And so, you know, we have a lot of people in the audience who support this organization, but support a lot of arts organizations and a lot of artists. And what would you tell them? You know, what would you tell the funders or the patrons or the people who care about artists about how to think about supporting artists who not just want to work in terms of emergency, but the structures about how to support this kind of work? Because I feel a lot of it is outdated, you know, and isn't thought about the right way, and yet more and more artists want to work this way. So what would you say to those people? Or to the, you know, funding world in general?
I'd say the definition of art as you know it needs to be put away because there's another thing coming, and it doesn't include the things that you have believed in from the very beginning, that why you started supporting the arts, because there's something more desperate and real that's always been there. And maybe what we've done and we've built this palace was maybe is directly personifying the exclusion that gets us to where we are. There was no fault, no harm that you were intending, but maybe the very things you build on need to be questioned again, and how you support things, and to be more flexible and understand the time, that things cannot be that artwork that you hang on the wall and you see it and you believe it. I know you can do that. I know you can, but there's another thing about our lives that are related to others, and that's a hard place to be. So it's almost transforming the institution to no longer be the institution that thought it was.
So I would love to answer that question a little differently, because I think that nobody has talked about beauty tonight. And I'm really concerned with beauty because it's one of my most effective tools. So the way the question was asked, it already sets up this sort of very binary approach of like, well, either you can support artists with things that you love and want to live with, or you can support artists to do work that's, you know, socially engaged. And I personally in my work reject that idea that you have to choose between one or the other. So as an artist, my currency is people's imagination and beauty. I make beautiful things. I want to make beautiful things. There's an incredible, you know, and it is strategic, right? I'm interested, as the conceptual part of my work, I'm interested in seducing the viewer, and I don't think that's different than ideas of social justice. In fact, the two are very, very connected. And so what do we do when we witness beauty, right? It's universal, right? When we witness something that's beautiful, we stop, we stare, we become quiet, okay? And so in the most basic of ways, I think that witnessing something beautiful is a way of recognizing ourselves in something that is not us, okay? And for that moment, we pause, right? We are open to something that is not completely bound by our ego. In that space of beauty, you know, if I lure people into that park because the reflections on this thing are crazy beautiful and they just want to move underneath it, I can also make them stop and read what's there, or witness an event, or watch a performance, or become part of it, or read about the intention, the bigger intention, right? But I can't do that if I haven't gotten their attention in the first place. So I just want to advocate a little bit for what clicked in my mind was when I realized that I didn't have to choose, and that in fact the most powerful thing I could do, the thing that I was being rewarded for and invited to do things and to have these spaces to do things in, was because I made beautiful things, and that was actually the most powerful tool I had, and that I didn't have to choose between that being the opposite, but rather that was a vehicle, a really powerful vehicle, right? Because it's a lot easier to convince somebody to experience something that deals with that's sort of bringing them in because they want to be there, and then inserting, sometimes in not obvious ways and sometimes in very subtle ways that are very effective, inserting all of these other things that become an important part of the read of the piece. So yeah.
Okay, I take that back. No, I think that I totally agree that, because I use formal aesthetics to lure people in. Right. Absolutely. Maybe what I mean is that the transformation is also to include, maybe you could be the spy within the institution. You could be the covert operative within. Don't name yourselves. But anyway, I totally agree that there's transformative. And we talked about how people in the age of internet, there's research of how people lose empathy. Mm-hmm. Children lose empathy, and that you create something awesome in order to shake it back to some kind of cognizance that there is something beyond you. And that's important, and things that are awesome and beautiful. So yay, right on, sisters.
I agree.
Okay. Well, good. We have time for a couple questions, if anyone is interested. Catherine. You want to stand up so everyone can hear you? Okay.
What you said made me think a lot about the art market in Medina, and you know, we've collected art for years, but I think about how can we change that dynamic of taking tremendous pride of having these beautiful objects on the wall that do have stories and do have a history and do talk to some of the things that we're talking about tonight, and instead give people the opportunity to take that money and actually invest it in one of these projects that has a very obvious social, you know, a social impact that has nothing to do with an object, but has a direct impact. Like how do we manifest that? How can I, as a collector, say, you know, I love your objects, Teresita, but I would instead like to know what change you want to accomplish, and how can I instead invest in that?
So to me, there's no difference. And so a little bit, I mean, I think it's great that you're asking that question, because I think that you have a lot of power to create new structures and to be creative about those structures. For me, it's a little bit like you can't pick and choose, right? And so sometimes artists are brought in to solve everything, right? And they want to be artists, right? Like they went to art school, their tools are these things, formal things, color, form, materials, all kinds of things, right? And so this idea that you can kind of like take one part of what an artist does but not the other part, you know, like what I was just saying was, you want me to make something beautiful? Great, it comes along with this too. The ideas are connected to these feelings that I have about how this space should be activated. I'll be honest and say that when I'm asked to do it the other way around, like, hey, can you come be the Latina artist because we need some diversity? It's not said that way. I'm sort of like, you know what, there's a reason why I make things, and there's a reason that's my language, right? You wouldn't invite a scientist to, do something with, I don't know, music. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's what you do. You wouldn't ask a lawyer to come up with a poem, and so I think that artists need to be honored because the work that they do is in fact very, very brave and very important. So in many parts of the world, we take it for granted here when we say, oh, artists can wiggle their way into these things. But in many parts of the world, in really, really oppressed places, the first people that get killed are women, poets, and artists, okay? And so artists are already doing in their own language, and it's worked for, hundreds and thousands of years, right? I mean, not hundreds of thousands of years maybe. They have already been able to change society using the language that they embrace, right? We know this, right? We know this if we look back at historical artworks and how they have, changed things. That we don't have to ask artists to be something that they're not,
My thought was just more like, maybe we could change the dialogue and say instead of the objects, like, Teresita, I love what you do, so I just want to fund a project that maybe doesn't have a physical outcome to it, or something, like you do.
Well, I make a lot of beautiful things, by the way. I couldn't show them. I just didn't show them because we didn't have time. But, keep the object alive. Purchase that. Follow your heart, follow your soul, follow the aesthetics that you have. But there's other aesthetics that the world you live in, there is other forms of beauty. The interaction of a human being that Teresita created underneath the thing, and what you've done with the seating that there was none, is really an aesthetic moment. There's the poetics of a moment that are intimate and dynamic of that moment, and that's what can be supported. It's not just the object and the ownership, because sometimes ownership and the whole world of things of that connotes a powerful mix. But sometimes, as an artist, I'm not into power. That is the worst thing, because no one wants to do what I want to do, really, But I want to do. When I look at the poetry of my interaction, I couldn't do that. Even the character in Chinese for Ren is. It means benevolence. It's the indefinable idea in Chinese philosophy is a person and the number 2. It's more than you, and it cannot be defined. So supporting, it doesn't even have to be art, supporting causes that you believe in that can arrive to some dynamic, poetic point of aesthetic, that's aesthetic too. We just have to open up the definition has been entrapped by, we're in a post-Kantian age. We can do this now. As Trudeau said, in our 2015, 2016, we can do this.
I'm curious what Chat thinks about this, because you're younger, you're starting out your career, and getting funding for projects is very difficult, at the beginning especially. And so I know that you're working with organizations and local organizations to you in Brooklyn or North Carolina who then get the funding for you. Right. But that's a real issue for you to get your work out there. So how can someone like Catherine or an individual support the kind of work that you're doing?
Right. Well, the way I create my projects is I try to find, it's a number of different ways, platforms and grants and fellowships and RFPs and a whole bunch
USA fellowships.
USA fellowships, yeah, of course. And I'm very grateful for all those. And so you have to be creative. That's part of a lot of the work that I do, and I'm sure everybody here does, is just kind of figuring out those avenues, those platforms and outlets that allows this work to actually happen. I did want to mention something that connects to a lot of the questions and the funding, but I think managing expectations and scope of a project is really important, both for the funder and the artist, and especially when you're coming in and working with people in a participatory way that might, for a lot of people, promise a lot, like what you said, a lot of times artists are expected to solve all these problems, and you have to be aware and conscious of what your limitations are and what actually the work can do. So the work that I do, I'm completely conscious of the fact that this is not solving real systemic problems of urban development and segregation and a lot of issues of injustice and inequities that do exist in the built environment. So the work is not posing as a solution to that. It's just kind of a poetic sort of alternative that does have a real function and does actually have an impact on a small scale. But I think that's sometimes a problem with the funding, that there's this expectation of like, your project then will create or equal this, or like there's this kind of equation to it. And I kind of mentioned this idea of like analytics of like measuring how many people is it going to impact and how many things and this and this and that, which is, I understand the function of that, and I think it's somewhat important to understand the scope of the project, but I think it's also, how do you measure a conversation? How do you measure just watching people or watching how people use a space and observing this and listening to people? It's really hard to do. So so I think that's important also.
I think we'll take one more question. Did you still have your question? I think we'll go to you. Yes, I'm very good.
Right. So, Teresita, you were saying that one of your earlier pieces in the slideshow is in a museum and that it's not really political and it's not activist, but your whole conversation and everything that is coming from your experience of being a Latina coming from Miami is inherently political. And I was just wondering, how do the three of you feel about this statement that Hank Willis Thomas recently said in an article that all artwork is inherently political, even if it belongs on this side of the spectrum that is object focused in the museum hanging on the wall versus a Black Lives Matter protest that's creatively organized?
So a lot of people have said that. Sorry. A lot of people have said that. That's a sort of an idea that's been around for a very long time, just as all religion is political, et cetera, et cetera. So when I say that those things aren't political, what I meant is they're not perceived as being political. I'm not perceived as being those things. It's a little bit like when you get asked, so what's it like to be a woman artist? And you're like, never known anything else. How about you? And you kind of don't know how to chop yourself up into all those pieces. So I just want to keep arguing for a holistic sense of what it is artists do. They don't walk into their studio and come up with an idea and walk around sort of with this anxiety about how to make this thing physically and how to engage communities and how to like use their conversation with the museum director to like create a new space, right? We don't I don't compartmentalize those things. And I would just like to argue for that sensibility of a holistic sense of the world, right? Like I'm thinking about the debate right now. It doesn't, like I'm wondering, right, what's gonna go happen tonight. That doesn't mean that I'm not being an artist when I'm thinking about those things. And when I'm in the studio, I'm not, in fact, everything, I can't even get to the studio in the morning without having already gone through my whole Twitter news feed and having everything that's happening that day already as part of an extension of my art practice by simply being a perceiving human being in the world, right? So just again, that idea that we keep trying to chop things up into either or this binary sort of like in or out, artist or activist, and the world simply isn't experienced that way. And I think that we could all be much more effective, object, event, it's like we keep trying to chop it up, and it actually isn't any of those things. It's actually, for me, the confluence of all of those things. Precisely where all of those things meet is where it becomes interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that that's been around. Yeah. So what? Yeah. Okay. I agree, Hank. But I think don't get the wrong idea. I mean, you also have a trend. If you say social practice, social engagement has become this catchword. It's almost like multiculturalism was a way to bring out the money, and I resent that. I resent that kind of definition because basically, I don't go track down disasters to make art. That is a stupid. Young people out there trying to make art, do not do that, because that doesn't do it. That's not the reason for being. It's to be human and to understand that the experience must be coming directly from an internal source. And the poetry from that, whether it's object, or it's a practice, or it's an engagement, is important. You know, I've been in Detroit, I've been in New Orleans, and you know, sometimes what I hear so often as I'm walking away, I'm in the neighborhood, they say, okay, you're not gonna come back, are you? And I used to say, what are you talking about? I'm an artist, I'm gonna create something here. And you know something, they're right, because when the funding dries up and everything, you're gone. And their poor people know better. They have been disenfranchised enough. They appreciate the ideas. But now recently when someone said that, I said, you know, you're right, I won't. But I won't stop till something comes back. So the idea is not to create a peace, but maybe to create a climate that's bearable for a moment, for someone, for yourself, that can allow someone to exist in. It's mostly yourself. And therefore, and share that. And maybe that's the beginning of the engagement.
Do you want to? Just.
Well, yeah. I mean, I agree with that statement. I mean, every project exists in the world, and the world is political and social. And I mean, the problem is that a lot of people might not necessarily recognize that their work is functioning within these constructs. So I think that would be the difference between someone that's aware of their work being and acting politically, and then someone who is not. And by doing that, by kind of being neutral or understanding it as being kind of the default, it's contributing to, you know, systems of oppression or domination. And so I think that, not always, of course, but that maybe could be the difference. But of course, yeah, everything, and not only art, but everything we do and everything we build is political. Yeah.
I want to say something, Teresita, that first piece that you showed, and you said it's non-political. Well, oh no, you didn't say that, but I'm going to say.
It's not perceived as political.
I'm going to say, when I looked at that piece liberates that oppressive space that I saw before your piece was in, and it is amazing. And I just want to say that, thank you. Because liberation can come in so many forms, and that can happen as obvious through what you've done. So anyway, I just had to say that.
So we're about to liberate all of you so that you can go see the debate. Well, those of you who can stomach a third debate. But I just want to thank our artists. This was a really great conversation. It's just so important, and thank you for pushing back, for questioning, for being here, for being a model, in this city that's still so young and changing so rapidly, and is in many ways, a city that looks like what the rest of the country will look like very soon. So we have so many interesting and unique issues here that we're all grappling with, but that we really turn to our artists to help us translate and understand. So I hope the artists that are out there are inspired by tonight to keep doing the work, but the work that's true to them, like what you said, Mel, that's really true to their own experience. They aren't searching out the issue to make the work. Thank you guys so much.